standing on the northern side of the site of Shilo, and there are 4 possible theories as to where the tabernacle actually stood in this area. And the idea of the tabernacle is truly a fascinating one, because if you think about it, it's the only structure that God actually instructed mankind to build, inside of which his presence would dwell. And there's a very significant detail connected with that. If you think about the fact that after Adam and Eve sinned, they are given a flesh covering to put over themselves. And then the tabernacle itself is a flesh covered structure inside of which God would choose to manifest his presence to the children of Israel and to the nations. The outside of it was actually covered with hide of what in some translations is called sea cows. And then if you think about human beings, he actually gave us the privilege to be the temple of the Holy Spirit. God really wanted to dwell among man, inside of man, in a flesh covering. This contrasts with the temple, which was actually King David's idea, although it was eventually built on the heavenly pattern. But it was David's idea and not God's idea. So the tabernacle is really unique in that way, in that it is the only structure that God actually commanded to be built so that his presence could dwell inside it. And there's something else that's fascinating about the idea of the tabernacle, because of course it is a movable structure. God says that heaven is his home and earth is his footstool. Where will you build a place for me to dwell? And if God is manifesting his presence in a tabernacle, it also means that the people and that he can move, they can go wherever he wants them to go. And of course he led them by the fire and by the cloud in the desert to show where he wanted to move. But the moment that you've got a fixed structure, that changes, and now all of a sudden the Holy One of Israel is confined to a fixed location. And that's a rather bizarre idea, to confine God to one place. And isn't that often what we want to do in the modern day period? We want to confine God to a structure. But what is very interesting in this whole season with COVID-19 is that it seems that God has desired to break out of those structures and to again manifest his presence on the streets and on the beaches, to burst out of the structure of the church and to take his presence and to take his gospel to the people who so desperately need him. So let's return for a moment to the ideas about where the tabernacle maybe stood. So in the first video in Shilo, we were at the southern part of the site where churches were built during the early Christian period. Now we're actually standing in the northern part of the site here. And behind me is an area that seems that it was deliberately leveled. The archaeologist Wilson, when he came here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he determined that this was probably the site of the tabernacle, and he had 3 reasons for that. One was because it looked like it had been leveled and structures had been built around it into the bedrock. Later they believed that they found rooms where perhaps the priests prepared for service, and we found in this area a large number of pottery vessels. And when the children of Israel would come up to Shilo 3 times a year to celebrate the feast of the Lord, they would eat from the sacrifices, but the sacrifices were holy to the Lord, and thus so were the vessels. So actually after they'd eaten the vessels, what they would do would be to smash them on the ground. And so there were tens of thousands of pieces of pottery vessels actually found in this area. So that was another convincing evidence. The third evidence is actually the orientation of this site. In this direction we have north, over here south, over here to the west, and over here to the east. So that means that this platform is oriented east-west. And of course, so was the temple in Jerusalem. You entered it from the east and you walked towards the Holy of Holies. That was positioned in the west. Another convincing evidence that I don't think Wilson mentioned, but modern day archaeologists will touch on, is the fact that there is an ancient valley going in this direction, in which there was a highway that went from the north to the south, from Shechem in the north all the way down to Beersheba in the south, connecting all of the important biblical sites in this area. and it's at a crossroads because there is another valley that goes in this direction, east to west. And crossroads were very often the places where in ancient times they would position important settlements. And Shilo would have been extremely important. All of Israel was required to come up here 3 times a year for 369 years. And the final piece of evidence that Wilson dwelt on is the fact that this platform has certain dimensions to it. And those dimensions are mentioned in Ezekiel 26 through, Exodus 26 through 28. And those dimensions exactly match what we find here. So a lot of convincing evidence is that this probably is where the tabernacle was placed and where all of the installations that would be needed were located around it. Imagine the animals and the sacrifices, the need for water, the need for washing away of the blood, the need for places for the priests to change their garments and the incense to be prepared. All of these types of things would have required special rooms. Now in 2017, another excavation was planned for this area to see what structures were found here, if it's possible that the tabernacle was just a little bit further to the west in this direction. And also another motivation of this excavation was further to discover the extent of the biblical tell, the mound, the ancient city, to discover where the cities were, where the city walls were in the Middle Bronze Age period, and also later on in the Iron Age period, in the period of the Judges and the period of Joshua and the children of Israel coming into the land. Now, this part of the site is connected with a couple of very important parts of the biblical narrative. So if we go to 1 Samuel and chapter 1 to chapter 4, we have the story of a woman who is barren. Of course, the woman is Hannah, and she comes to pray somewhere close to here in the tabernacle, and she asks for God to have mercy on her, and her lips are not moving as she prays. And Eli, the high priest, actually thinks that she's drunk and asks her what she's doing. And then when he understands that she is crying out to God to give her a child, he actually speaks his blessing over her. And of course, she has the son that grows up to be Samuel, who becomes a prophet and a judge for all of Israel. And in Samuel chapter 2, we have this beautiful prayer of exaltation as Hannah is exalting the Lord. And this prayer has a really strong parallel in the Gospel of Luke, when Elizabeth finds out that she's pregnant. She's carrying John the Baptist, and then her baby gets to meet Yeshua as Miriam comes to her, and both the women are carrying these extraordinary men inside of them, 6 months apart from each other. And Elizabeth also gives the prayer that later becomes known as the Magnificat. So let me read you just a couple of verses of Hannah's prayer. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in Adonai. My horn is lifted high in Adonai. I smile widely over my enemies, for I rejoice in your salvation." And you can just hear the gratitude from her heart overflowing in this place as she understands what the Lord has done for her. And in fact, I don't know if you can see, but just behind me there is actually a woman praying there. And still, even until the modern day period, women who are barren will come to this site and they will ask God for mercy, that he will open their womb and that they will bring forth children. And if you go and ask the people that work at this site, they will tell you story of miracle after miracle after miracle. These are modern Orthodox Jews who will actually come to you and tell you what God has done for the women of this area when they have come and prayed at this site. Now, of course, we all know that the story of Shilo doesn't end very well, because this is the place where Eli's sons become disobedient and rebellious and disrespectful, and the consequences of this are that the Philistines defeat the Israelites in the Battle of Evan-Haezer. The tabernacle is destroyed, and the ark is captured and it is taken around the hill country. Well, perhaps the physical structures surrounding the tabernacle are destroyed, but we think that the tabernacle itself may have been taken to Nov and Gibeon, and that it may have ended up in the vicinity of Jerusalem. But this becomes the story of a new beginning in this place, from tabernacle to temple, because of course after this Samuel judges Israel. He walks around Israel in a kind of a discipleship style of teaching and ministering, and then after this David becomes king in Jerusalem. He takes over from Saul. He's first king in Hebron, then he's king in Jerusalem, and then eventually his son Samuel builds the temple in Jerusalem, and that then becomes the center for the Jewish people. But don't forget Shilo. Don't forget that this place was the capital of Israel for 369 years. This is the place where the tabernacle stood for 369 years. This is the place where God chose to manifest his presence to the children of Israel for 369 years.